Welcome to Season 2 of Ed Falco on the Air. This season, I'm reading short stories, my own and others, and in today's episode, I'll be reading Wild Girls, a story originally published in the Missouri Review and later included in Burning Man, my collection from Southern Methodist University Press. Wild Girls begins in a bar in the East Village, where a successful, late middle-aged artist who earns a living as a mentor and a teacher of young, aspiring artists finds himself in the company of two young women, one a current and the other a former student of his. What starts as a playful, then provocative, and finally reckless flirtation quickly turns into something more complicated as the trio leaves the bar and heads back to his apartment for a threesome. When Deborah said, "Jason, you know I'm a little in love with you," he pretended not to hear. Deborah was 21. She was a tattooed and bejeweled art student currently taking his painting class. He had met Marilyn, a graduate student with whom he had become friends over the past few years, for a drink at a noisy East Village bar, a bar, it turned out, that Deborah frequented. When she saw him sitting in a high-backed booth with Marilyn, whom she knew, she came over to say hello. Marilyn invited her to join them, and now the three of them had been drinking and telling stories for hours. Jason looked away, across the bar, where he could see their booth reflected in a tall mirror. On a good day, in bad light, he could pass for a guy in his mid-40s. He worked out daily and was in better shape than many of his 20 and 30-year-old students who were given at this stage in their lives to smoking, drinking, and a generally dissolute life. His life, on the other hand, was compulsively ordered. He woke, ate breakfast, and went directly to his studio to paint all morning. When he was finished painting, he exercised for an hour to an hour and a half, which included a 2-mile power walk, then home to shower before teaching his late afternoon and evening classes. He had followed variations on that routine most of his adult life. For the past 3 years, since the breakup of his last serious, long-term relationship, he had followed the routine exactly. His productivity in that time had skyrocketed, and his art career had jumped to a higher gear. But he had also begun to think of himself as a kind of monk, since he had no social life whatsoever anymore beyond an occasional evening out, like this one, for drinks with one of his students or an old friend. In the tall mirror, he saw two young women staring at each other, while a middle-aged man looked away across the barroom. Both women were surrounded by the resonant aura of their youth. Their skin was alive with it. The air around them vibrated with it. Deborah had a tattoo of a snake curling over her bare shoulders and along her collarbone to her neck, where its small red eyes watched whomever she faced. Marilyn, who was about 10 years older than Deborah, looked nonetheless like a high school girl in comparison. She wore jeans and a man's undershirt with a V-neck that showed cleavage and a quarter-size tattoo of a rose high on her right breast. Deborah's dark hair was long and silky and streaked bright red. Marilyn's hair was naturally blonde and cut boyishly short. Deborah wore a slinky black halter top that left her midriff bare above white pants cut impossibly low. Marilyn's jeans were tight, but cut like a man's, with a high waist. They were both beautiful. And he, blessedly, didn't look so bad himself in his ordinary blue jeans and black short-sleeved shirt that showed off muscular arms. His hair was graying and thinning, but it was still there, a respectable head of it, looking silvery against the black of his shirt. Marilyn placed her elbows on the table, folded her hands together, rested her chin on her knuckles, and leaned across the table to Deborah. "Jason," she stage whispered, "appears to be pretending he didn't hear you." "Do you think?" she said, her eyes going wide, play-acting great surprise. She pushed Jason's shoulder. "Jason," she said, Are you pretending you didn't just hear me tell you that I'm kind of in love with you? Jason watched the three of them a moment longer in the tall mirror. Deborah had a mischievously wicked look about her, clear even across the room, reflected in a smoky mirror. Marilyn, watching Deborah, looked amused. "How much have you had to drink?" Jason asked. He nudged Deborah's knee with his own as he turned back to her with an exaggerated look of reprimand and touched the rim of her martini glass, out of which she had emptied 3 or 4 bright red cocktails of some kind. "What are those potions you've been drinking?" "I'm not drunk," she said, folding her arms across her chest as if indignant. "My tongue hath been loosened, yes," she said, "but I'm not drunk." Marilyn said, "I'm not drunk. I've only had 3 watered-down bourbons." She paused dramatically and smiled as if something juicy was about to be revealed. "And I'm," she said, "also a little in love with you." "Really?" Deborah spun around to face Marilyn. Her expression was somewhere between pissed off and shocked. Jason finished off the last of his scotch. "I think we've all been drinking too much," he said, "and it's getting late." Marilyn said, "It's only 10 o'clock, Jason. This is when I usually start getting dressed to go out for the night." "Well, see," he said, "there you go. By 10 o'clock, I'm usually in my PJs, sipping a nice hot cup of decaffeinated tea, getting ready for bed." Both girls laughed at that, assuming, he guessed, that he was putting them on. He wasn't. His tone was exaggerated for effect, but the facts were gospel. By 10 o'clock, most nights, he was curled up in bed with a cup of tea on the nightstand, reading a book or a journal. Deborah leaned across the table to Marilyn, her chin resting in the palm of her hand. "Are you really that into him, too?" "Yes," she said, "I am." She winked at Jason. "He's cute, don't you think? I go for big, muscular types, but they have to be brainy or talented, too." Deborah looked at Jason appraisingly. "It's not his looks so much," she said to Marilyn, though still gazing at Jason. "I think it's because he's so fucking decent," she said. "I'm dying to corrupt him." Marilyn said, "He does have that decent thing going." "Jesus," Deborah said, as if suddenly exasperated. "I've been throwing myself at him all semester, and he acts like he doesn't notice. Then he just goes on being decent. It's maddening. I want to throw him down and fuck his brains out." "Deborah," Jason said, the reprimand in his voice serious now, "really?" "I think it's because he's an accomplished artist," Marilyn said, ignoring Jason entirely. "How many men are we going to meet in our lives with Jason's kind of talent? Think about it. Before we go back to the little towns we came from, surrounded by little lives." Deborah raised her eyebrows at Marilyn. "I'm from San Francisco," she said. She looked pointedly at Jason. "And I plan on being just as successful and accomplished as Jason here, if not more so." "Good for you," Jason said. "I'm from Coldwell, West Virginia," Marilyn said, "God help me." "Coldwell, West Virginia," Deborah repeated. "That sounds hard." "Trust me," Marilyn said. "I'm not going to meet anyone like Jason there." Jason said, "May I say something?" Deborah said to Marilyn, "What do you think? Should we let him join in the conversation?" Marilyn said, "Why not?" Both girls gazed at him and then said, "Yes," almost simultaneously. At the front of the bar, a noisy collection of young couples pushed through the door in mid-conversation, laughing and shouting at each other as they came in off the street. Everyone in the bar stopped for a moment and looked at them, and then the group fell silent when they realized they were the center of attention. For an eerie few seconds, the only sound in the bar was a plaintive saxophone solo, one Jason had heard before, moody and evocative, filled with sensual grief, but barely audible over the sustained hum of air conditioning. The air smelled thickly of smoke, tinged with a hint of perfume. Then, as quickly as the silence had descended, it lifted, and the bar was filled again with noise and activity. It was getting crowded as the evening wore on. People were too deep at the bar, and standing around talking in clumps everywhere. "Just," Jason said, "I'm afraid it really is getting late for me." He held up his empty glass. "It's getting to be time." "Jason," Marilyn said, leaning across the table and grasping his hand, I refuse to let you go. You always run away when we get to this point in the evening. And what point is that? The point where something might happen. Deborah said, He does that with you too? She shoved Jason. That's just what you do with me. Jason removed his hand from Marilyn's. I think you're confusing running away with leaving. I've never run away after seeing either one of you. I've left and gone home, which is just, what else? He shrugged, suggesting he was nonplussed by the notion that he would do anything other than leave and go home after having spent time with either of them for whatever reason. Marilyn said, We've been flirting for years now. Don't pretend you're not aware of it. Me too, Deborah said. You flirt with me too, Jason. Under the table, she touched his foot with hers. Jason could come up with no immediate reply, and so was silent as he returned Marilyn's stare. It was true that he flirted with both of them. He always flirted a little with women. It meant nothing. I suppose I flirt, he said, at first serious. Then he tried to make a joke of it. He ran his fingers through his thinning hair. I'm getting old fast, he said. I'm on the steep downward slope to the grave. I crave the attention of beautiful young women. Means I'm not quite dead yet. Oh, stop, Deborah said. She nudged his leg under the table. You're not so old. Yes, he is, Marilyn said. He's 55. She touched Jason's hand. But I don't think that's what it's about, the way you are with women. You don't? I think you're lonely and full of desire, she said. You look at women as if you'd like to swallow us whole, as if you'd like to lick every inch of us from our toes to the top of our heads. Deborah laughed and put a hand on Jason's shoulder. I think Marilyn might be projecting just a little bit there, she said. Marilyn laughed too. I might be, she argued. But I do think the lonely and desire stuff works. Don't you? Isn't that what you see in his eyes? Deborah dropped her hand from Jason's shoulder to his forearm. Her eyes met Marilyn's, and they both smiled, shy smiles. Jason, Deborah said, you came of age in the 60s. I bet you've engaged in an orgy or two in your time. Jason covered his face with both hands and rested his elbows on the table as if he needed to take a little nap. He had, in fact, in his early 20s, when he would have called himself a hippie, participated in a sexual adventure involving more than two people. But that was before he turned his back on the self-indulgence of the times. He remembered the encounter as a strange mix of comedy and lust. He knew Marilyn and Deborah both thought he was wrestling with temptation, but he was actually wrestling with something more like annoyance. It bothered him suddenly that these two girls felt so free to toy with him. They both knew he wouldn't take them up on their offer, even if he were seriously tempted, if for no other reason than the knowledge of how his colleagues would eviscerate him once the story got out, as it inevitably would. Marilyn's precious analysis of him as lonely and full of desire was especially annoying. The glibness of it stung. He felt suddenly like an adult who had let two precocious children get the better of him. Ah, Deborah said. She patted Jason on the back of his hand. Look what we've done to the poor guy. We're seductresses, Marilyn said, apparently to Deborah. She touched Jason's elbow. She whispered, We're just too wicked. Jason lifted his head from his self-imposed darkness. Amid the growing clamor of the barroom, the various shouts and loud laughing and squeals, he heard himself say to Deborah, I have a king-size bed in my apartment. It's only a couple of blocks from here. Deborah's face went blank for a moment, and her mouth opened slightly. Oh my God, she said. Really? Marilyn watched Jason intently for a few seconds before she got up from the table and said, I've got the check. Meet you guys out front. For an apartment that had cost him close to $1 million more than 10 years earlier, the lobby, such as it was, looked remarkably dilapidated. A glass door set in a plate glass wall opened onto a small room with mailboxes and a second door that led to the elevator. Jason unlocked the outside door, held it open for the girls, and then pulled it closed until he heard the familiar click it made when it locked. For a moment, he stood with his back to Deborah and Marilyn, looking out at the street, at a line of worn-down buildings, and at the hunched-over figure of an old man shuffling along the sidewalk. When he turned around, the girls were standing side by side, holding hands, watching him. The red streaks in Deborah's hair, the snake tattoo on her neck, the halter top that left half her breasts exposed, and pants cut so low she surely had to wax to wear them, all of that did nothing to keep her from looking like a worried little girl. Marilyn, in comparison, looked confident and greatly entertained by the situation. "Cute," he said, nodding toward their clasped together hands. "You're cute," Marilyn said. "You should see how scared you look." "I look scared," he said, unlocking the second door. "Why would I be scared?" "Beats us," Marilyn said, as if fully empowered to speak for Deborah. Jason held the door open for them and gestured with a flourish to the elevator. Deborah entered the room first. "I'm not scared," Jason said, and as Marilyn walked past him, he ran his hand from the small of her back down over her ass. He smiled when she flinched. Once the three of them were in the elevator, he inserted the key in its slot and turned it sharply. The small compartment lurched once before smoothly beginning its slow ascent. "This is cool," Deborah said. "You have your own elevator." She appeared to be trying to hook her thumbs in the pockets of her jeans, but the pants were much too tight, and her hands kept falling awkwardly across her thighs. "So this is something you've done before?" Jason asked. He looked back and forth from Marilyn to Deborah. "I don't think you've ever answered that question yourself," Marilyn said. "Have you ever done anything like this before?" "Very long time ago," Jason said, "in a distant galaxy." Deborah laughed, and Marilyn said, "How long ago? 20 years? 30 years? 30 years, Deborah said, as if that span of time was inconceivable. "More than 30, actually." "Oh my God," Deborah said, and pushed him. "You are old." Marilyn said, "Tell us the story." When the elevator door opened onto his living room, both girls seemed surprised. Marilyn did a quick scan of the room, her eyes raking over the bookcases, the wall-mounted plasma TV, the high ceilings, the various artworks, sculptures, and paintings, the hardwood floor, and the spare furnishings, a sectional couch, a leather recliner under a black lamp, end tables, and a long table in front of the couch that looked like a work of art more than a coffee table. "Wow," she said. "Gorgeous place." "Is that an original Andy Warhol?" Deborah asked, walking into the room with her eyes fixed on a prized Warhol print. "That's a complicated question with his art," Jason said, joining her in admiring the screen print. "But essentially, yes, it was a gift from him." As if she found it barely possible to believe, she said, "You knew Andy Warhol?" Jason didn't answer for a second. He did some, quote, calculations and figured out Deborah must have been about 2 years old when Andy died. He realized that to her, Andy Warhol, someone he had known quite well, someone with whom he had spent a great deal of time, a kind of teacher as well as a friend, to her, Andy Warhol was an historical figure, someone she had studied in art history class, as distant to her as Hieronymus Bosch. He laughed off her amazement. "He died not even 20 years ago," he said. "Wine?" He called across the room to Marilyn. He started for the kitchen and his wine cabinet. "Not me," Marilyn answered. "I think we should get right to the threesome." She leaned against the wall and called to Deborah. "This is a Cindy Sherman." She pointed to a photograph alongside her head. "Jason was her teacher." "Briefly," Jason said, "and not in photography, obviously." He flopped down on the couch. "So," he said, "are we having class here or what?" "Don't get petulant," Marilyn said. Deborah said, "I'll have that wine. I'm losing my buzz." Marilyn said, "I'll get it." To Jason, she said, "Is it in the kitchen?" "Cabinet next to the sink." Once Marilyn disappeared into the kitchen, Deborah, who had been studying the Warhol, took a few steps back from it, turned in a slow circle, taking in the room, and smiled when her eyes lighted on Jason. She seemed surprised to find him there, watching her. "I want a place like this one day," she said softly, almost reverently, full of art, full of all the famous artists I've known. Jason, without intending to, made a little sound, something like a laugh, that could have been interpreted as disdainful. Deborah didn't notice. She sat alongside him and put her hand on his knee. "You really do think I have the talent, don't you, Jason? It's not just encouragement?" "Absolutely," he said. He put his hand over her hand, which was resting on her knee. "You have all the talent you need." From the kitchen, Marilyn called, "Hey, you guys aren't starting without me, are you?" "No way," Deborah called back. She smiled radiantly at Jason and then jumped up and kissed him on the cheek, a friendly peck. "I definitely need some more wine, though. Can you believe we're doing this? Oh my God." "Hardly," Jason said. When he could think of nothing else to say, he let himself stare. The way she was draped over the couch, with her legs tucked under her and one arm flung over the backrest, she might have been posing for a magazine ad. The lines of her bare stomach were exquisite, and he was tempted to reach across the space between them to touch her hair, which was lustrous and long, and would feel lovely, he knew, sliding through his fingers. "Yes," she said, watching him. "What are you thinking?" "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about touching your hair." "Do you like my hair?" She grabbed a strand and hung on to it. "I need that wine first," she said, and she pressed both hands over her stomach. "I'm getting butterflies. I've never done this kind of thing before. What's it like?" She pushed him. "You're all up for it, aren't you?" she said. "And here I thought you were like this totally controlled guy." "He's in control," Marilyn said. She came in from the kitchen carrying an open bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "What did you pick?" Jason asked. "An Italian," she said, holding up the bottle for him to see. "Nothing too special." She looked at the label, 2003. "Good choice," he said, helping her with the glasses. "Fill me up." Deborah snatched a glass and held it out to Marilyn. "This is so fucking crazy," she said. "Can you believe we're doing this?" "Sure I can," Marilyn said. She leaned over Jason to fill Deborah's glass. "It's going to be an experience," she said. "It's going to be something we'll never forget." "I'll bet," Deborah said, and she downed half the glass of wine in 2 swallows. "You are nervous," Jason said. "Top me off." Deborah held out the glass again. "I need to get my buzz back." "You need to relax," Marilyn said, refilling her glass. "We don't want you drunk, honey," she added, with an exaggeratedly serious look, as if she might have been a mother giving a daughter worldly advice before a big date. "I just need a little more buzz," Deborah said to Marilyn. To Jason, she said, "So you've done this before. You didn't tell us. Did you like it? Was it great?" "Yes," Marilyn said, "tell us." She slid closer to Jason on the couch and rubbed his ankle with her foot, encouraging him to talk. Jason sighed and then quickly ran through the details. "I was in my early 20s, he said. I kicked around Europe a while after school, and I met this woman. Her name was Livia, in, believe it or not, the British Museum Library. We were both looking at art books. Anyway, we got to be friends. She invited me back to her apartment. It was like mid-afternoon, and we went to bed. Then in the midst of things, this other woman walks in, and it's like Olivia jumps up. I'm in bed, naked. Turns out the woman is her lover. She's gay. Or bi, I guess. And we're like, busted. So this other woman, she's, okay, fine. She looks me over, takes off her clothes, and the 3 of us spent the rest of the afternoon together. That was it. Never saw either of them again." "How crazy is that?" Deborah said. "That's such an artist's story, don't you think?" She looked across Jason to Marilyn. "Bet that kind of thing wouldn't happen in Coldwell, West Virginia." Marilyn said theatrically, "Actually—" "Oh my God," Deborah said. "You've had a threesome in Coldwell, West Virginia?" "Actually," Marilyn repeated, "several." "Several?" Jason said. "As in 3, 4? "A lot more than that," she said. "It was a fairly regular event." "Oh my God," Deborah said. "What do you mean, regular?" "My ex," she said, and then shrugged, as if even she couldn't explain her own behavior. "I was a very different person then, and my ex, He'd bring home girlfriends all the time. I was just expected, Jason said. But were you into it? Was it something you wanted? Not really, she said. It's hard to explain. He wanted it, and it was just like the person I was at the time. I don't know. I felt like I had no choice. It's hard to explain, really. I just did what he wanted me to do. Oh my God, Deborah said. That's so, fucked up. Yes, Marilyn said, completely. She raised her eyebrows and made a face that suggested she too was amazed at how fucked up she had once been. She added, It just took me a while to figure it out. Jason asked, How old were you when all this was going on? Young, Marilyn said, very young. She winked to Deborah. Younger than our young friend here. Damn, Deborah said. You guys have so much history. Everybody has history, Marilyn said. Not me, Deborah answered. I've been in school my whole life. You guys have been married and done all that real world. She stopped abruptly and reddened a little, as if she was embarrassed. Shit, she said. I don't think I know what I'm talking about. She laughed and then finished off her wine with Marilyn and Jason watching her. After a long moment of silence, she said, Well, don't just both stare at me. She was probably trying to sound amusing, but she sounded peeved. You know what? Marilyn said. She smiled at Deborah and then ran her fingers through Jason's hair. I think Deb and I should go get ourselves ready in the bedroom. She reached across Jason, leaning her body over his as she put her wine glass down on the table and took Deborah's glass away from her. You, she said to Jason, her voice dripping with sexual suggestiveness, you should wait out in the deck. She got up, took Deborah by the hand, and pulled her up from the couch. Whoa, Deborah said, as if getting up had made her dizzy. She laughed and leaned against Marilyn, who wrapped her arms around her waist. I guess, she said, and laughed again. Here we go. Here we go, Marilyn echoed. She kissed Deborah on the cheek and winked at Jason. Leave the door open so you can hear us, she said. We'll call you when we're ready. Oh my God, Deborah said to Jason. This is so crazy. She looked at Marilyn and said, I think I'm getting excited. At that, Marilyn kissed her gently on the lips and said, This is going to be fun. To Jason, she said, That way? She looked across the apartment to a dark hallway. Jason nodded, and then she waved him out to the deck before turning around, taking Deborah with her, and heading down the hallway to the bedroom. After both girls had disappeared into the master bedroom, and the light had come on, casting its precise yellow rectangle into the hallway and halfway up the wall, Jason listened for a while on the couch as drawers opened and closed, and the sliding door to his walk-in closet squealed slightly as it was pulled along its track, stuck briefly, and then squealed again until, fully opened, it banged against the wall. Then the mattress squeaked, and both girls laughed, and Jason's thoughts were pulled, disastrously, to his first wife and the son they had adopted once they learned Jason couldn't father children. The boy's name was Callan. They had adopted him from Romania as a toddler. He was a smiling, beatific, robust angel of a boy whom his wife had fallen instantly in love with, as had Jason. They spent a month in Romania working out the adoption, and then 6 more wonderful months with Callan at home before he got sick. Then a year and a half of misery before it was all over. Everything all over, Callan gone. Teresa, his wife, back home with her parents. She didn't even bother with the details of the divorce. She just picked up and left a few days after the funeral, leaving Jason to contact lawyers. During those 6 months at home with Teresa and Callan, which Jason still thought of as the best 6 months of his life, the boy loved to jump on the mattress. Jason would stand on one side of the bed and Teresa on the other. They'd hold his hands while he jumped and squealed. Jason took the wine bottle with him out onto the deck, where he poured himself a glass as he looked out blankly across the hazy air to a line of apartments over street-level shops. In a window directly across from him, a young woman walked through her kitchen, dressed in a white t-shirt and black underwear. It took her a second to cross the room, and then she was gone, leaving Jason feeling as though he were surrounded by sexy women. Everywhere he looked, there were women, one more alluring than the next. He took his wine glass and stretched out on a lounge chair. To his left, he could see into his apartment, all the way back to the yellow light from the bedroom. To his right, tall apartment buildings rose all around him. Though he knew in a moment Marilyn would call his name, and he'd go to the bedroom to find her and Deborah awaiting him, it still seemed impossible. It all felt more like a game than a sexual intrigue. And though he supposed in a very short while he'd be in bed with Deborah and Marilyn, doing the things one does in such a situation, it still didn't seem real. Marilyn seemed more amused than aroused, and Deborah seemed like a child. He had told her honestly she had all the talent she needed to succeed as an artist. What he didn't tell her was how incredibly unlikely it was that she'd have the luck and resolve she'd also need, along with the even more unlikely chance she'd have the kind of vision as an artist that was of interest to anyone other than herself, or that she'd have the kind of character and intelligence that could translate the chaos of experience into something meaningful and resonant, or, even better and more rare, something beautiful. Those were the miracles she'd need. Talent was plentiful. At a sound of footsteps, Jason turned to find Marilyn walking toward him along the hallway. She was wearing his white terry cloth robe, which was absurdly big on her, and all the more sexy for the way she had it rolled up and tucked in. When she saw he had noticed her, she stopped and waved him into the room. "Problem," she said softly. "Really?" Jason picked up the wine bottle in his glass and joined her in the hallway, stopping to close the big glass door behind him, muting the sounds of traffic and the hum of a helicopter passing nearby. "She's freaking," Marilyn whispered. "She's scared, and she's embarrassed because she's scared. She wants to, but she feels like she's going to throw up, etc., etc." Jason couldn't repress a broad smile. "I wonder what happened to all the bravura from the bar," he asked. "Did you remind her that it was her suggestion?" "I did," Marilyn said. "Believe me, she's fully aware. I think that's why she's so embarrassed." "We'll have to let her off the hook," Jason said. "Really?" Marilyn said. She looked disappointed. "I wouldn't want to corrupt her," he said, alluding to Deborah's remark at the bar about wanting to corrupt him. Marilyn smiled at that. "She's so beautiful," she said. "The tail of that snake tattoo wraps around her breast. Jesus, you could die. She's so deliciously ripe." Jason broke into another broad smile that built to a small laugh. "It's her you're into," he said. "I'm such an egotistical ass. I thought it was me." She put her arm around his neck and kissed him on the cheek. "I do like you," she said. "You're sweet. All those threesomes with my exes, though, they had an unintended consequence." "You figured out men were expendable." She smiled. "He liked to watch," she said, still whispering. "For a long time, he had to push me. Then, I got to like it." "You're wild," Jason said. "You're something else." "Hey," Deborah's voice came loud from the bedroom. "Are you guys talking about me? I hear you whispering." In the bedroom, they found Deborah sitting up on the left side of the bed, a pillow folded behind her back, her legs stretched out and crossed at the ankles. She was wearing one of Jason's shirts that came down to mid-thigh. She looked as though she had primped and propped herself up to look as sexy as possible. The light blue shirt was unbuttoned far enough to show the body of the snake descending from her collarbone and beginning to wrap around her breast. The bottom of the shirt fell open between her thighs, accenting the valley of tanned skin where her legs met. "I've got it together now," she said, with a coyness that suggested she was amused at herself, at the unexplainable childishness of her behavior. "I think it was just a little momentary panic." "Well, very good," Marilyn said. She was standing beside the bed, and she shrugged off her robe and let it slide to the floor, revealing her body with obvious pride. Deborah looked across the bed to Marilyn, and at first the coy and sexy expression on her face held, but then, a second later, it seemed frozen there unnaturally, and a second after that, her eyes welled up with tears, and she covered her face with her hands and sobbed, "Oh God, I can't, I'm so embarrassed." "Jesus Christ," Marilyn said. She put her robe back on. "I'm so humiliated," Deborah said. "Do you fucking believe this?" Marilyn said to Jason. She sat on the right side of the bed and stretched out her legs. "Don't be mad," Deborah whimpered, still hiding behind her hands. "Please." "I'm not mad," Jason said. To Marilyn, he said, "You're not really mad, are you?" Marilyn seemed to have to think about that for a second. "No," she said finally, "I'm not mad." Deborah peeked out from behind her hands. "Really?" "Really," Marilyn said. Jason left the bedroom to go get the wine and the glasses, and when he came back, he found the two girls sitting where he had left them. Marilyn looking at one of his early assemblages hanging on the right side of the room, and Deborah looking at the pulled curtains on the left side of the room. He handed them both wine glasses, filled them, then filled his own glass before turning out the lights and pulling back the curtains, letting the city lights from the street and the surrounding apartment buildings illuminate the room. He took off his shoes and socks and climbed into the bed between them, facing them, sitting up with his back against the footboard. "It's not quite an orgy," Marilyn said, holding out her wine glass for a toast, "but it's nice." Jason clinked glasses with Marilyn. Deborah, though, continued to stare out the window. "Deborah," Jason said, "everything's fine. Really." "Are you sure?" she said, still looking out the window. She swiped a hand across her eyes, wiping away tears. "I feel like such an idiot. And it was my idea to begin with." "You're not an idiot," Marilyn said. "You're just confused, which, who isn't at 21? At that, Deborah turned to look at them. She said solemnly, "You guys really aren't mad at me?" Marilyn said, "I swear I'm not mad." She laid her bare ankle over Jason's bare ankle. "And Jason here," she said. "I bet this is the hottest night he's had in ages." "Unquestionably," Jason said, and took a sip of his wine. "You guys are sweet," she said, but she still sounded sad. She followed Marilyn's lead and laid her bare ankle over Jason's other bare ankle. She smiled wanly, as if she was deeply disappointed with herself, as if she had just discovered she wasn't the person she thought she was, and she couldn't quite get over it. She turned again to look out the window, her eyes wet with tears, her body slumping with her sadness. Marilyn looked as though she wanted to say something to Deborah. She watched her a moment, her eyes full of tenderness, and then turned wearily to look in the direction of the assemblage in the wall. She seemed suddenly very tired, as she held the wine glass to her chest and disappeared into herself. With both girls looking away, lost in their own worlds, Jason was free to stare at them unabashedly. He let his gaze move slowly over each of them, taking in the subtle shifts in skin tone where the curves of their bodies were shadowed or illuminated by the dim light from the window. He followed the deep green of Deborah's snake, with its pinpoints of red for eyes, until it disappeared under the soft blue of her shirt, the shirt's thin cotton fabric shaping itself to her breasts. On the inside of Marilyn's leg, the faint darker line of a vein traveled up her thigh, widening before it was lost under the white nap of the terry cloth robe. He watched them so intently he could feel himself dropping into one of those moments when time and experience and history and knowledge and ideas, when everything slips away and all that remains is vision, all that's left is the act of seeing. When he was filled with that moment, when the room seemed to hum with the absence and fullness of it, he lay his head back on the footboard and turned his eyes blankly to the ceiling. As if from someplace outside himself, he saw the three of them in his bed, each looking in a different direction. He closed his eyes and let himself feel the place where their bodies touched, their skin over his skin at the ankles. In his body, he felt the touch vividly. In his mind, he entertained the idea of them, the idea of the three of them at different stages in their lives come together in this instant. When, in his heart, he felt a bubbling up of gratitude, he tried to breathe more slowly. If he could have, he would have stopped breathing entirely, anything to extend the moment before it passed, as it would, and the world returned with a rush, like the explosion when someone touches a match to a torch, like the blaze when the torch goes up in flame. That was Wild Girls, a story that starts as a tale of transgression and ends in a moment of transcendence. Or at least that's how I read it. If you read it differently, I'd be happy to hear from you. For that matter, I'd be happy to hear from you regarding any of the stories I read on this podcast. You can contact me at falco.ed@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and please come back next week when I'll be reading The Revenant, a story of mine that was originally published in the Southern Review and later included in the annual Pushcart Prize anthology and in Sabbath Night in the Church of the Piranha, new and selected stories from Unbridled Books. Till then, be well, take good care.